You a bitch, nigga. Hey, man, why be mad at me too, man? Why you mad at me? Because you had to fake it till you make it.
I know I didn't think it was over with.
Salute to everybody. Today we're going to be experiencing, witnessing, hearing about a tragic story of a hard-working father, husband, brother, uncle, businessman that was tragically murdered, killed at his place of business over a vehicle, and all of the facts and what really happened and why did he have to lose his life so young. Like she said, black men deserve to grow old. So y'all send condolences to Mia Jaye and the family and his kids, and let's take a journey and explore the facts and circumstances that led up to that fateful day. True. Yeah. All right, the defendant, Adrian Moore, was convicted in Shelby County Criminal Court. Second degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, especially aggravated robbery, and 2 counts of possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, and received an effective sentence of 46 years. Let's get to the facts. This is the dude that killed Mia Jaye's brother over a car. But pay attention to the last name because it's going to make sense. Let me see. All right. At trial, Kenya Jardine testified that the victim was her husband and that they had 4 children who ranged in age from 6 to 18 years old at the time of the shooting. In March 2020, Ms. Jardine and the victim managed an automobile dealership, VHIX, on Covington Pike. They bought vehicles for the business at auction or from other local dealers and advertised them on Facebook Marketplace. Interested customers would come to the dealership to inspect and purchase the vehicles. Ms. Jardine testified that on May 12, 2020, the defendant purchased a 2009 Nissan Altima. The Altima had 200,000 miles on the odometer, and the defendant paid $2,700 for the car. On May 20th, the defendant returned to the dealership, so that's 8 days later, because the car was having mechanical problems. Ms. Jardine said she immediately got scared when she saw the defendant arrive because he was wearing a red bandana around his neck and was very distraught. The victim invited the defendant into his office, told the defendant to calm down, and insinuated that he was going to return $600 or $700 to the defendant. The defendant and the victim shook hands, and the defendant left. Ms. Jardine stated, "In my mind, I just kind of knew it wasn't like the end. It just didn't look like it was a done situation." Ms. Jardine identified a video recorded at the dealership on May 20th, 2020. The video showed a silver Lexus pull into the parking lot about 3 p.m. A man wearing blue jean shorts, a white tank top, and a red bandana around his neck got out of the front passenger seat of the Lexus and went into the dealership. The man returned to the Lexus about 18 minutes later, and the Lexus left the dealership. Ms. Jardine testified that the next morning, she and the victim went to a vehicle auction. They returned home after the auction, and the victim went to VHIX. Miss Jardine did not want him to go to the dealership because she thought the defendant was supposed to return for the $700 that day. When the victim left home, he had his wallet and cash to pay for a vehicle he had won at the auction. He also had a Ruger handgun that he carried for protection. The gun was black and very small. Ms. Jardine testified that she later received a telephone call from the victim's niece, Zandra, who worked at VX. Zandra was screaming and told Mrs. Jardine that this guy came up here and shot Uncle Jerry. Ms. Jardine and her children went to the hospital, and Ms. Jardine spoke with a police officer. The victim had lost a lot of blood and was unconscious, and hospital personnel told Ms. Jardine that he might not wake up. He might not wake up. What the hell going on? Let me see. Hold on for a minute. He minus 2. Where 3 at? Hold up, man. Hold on for a minute. So this say page 2. Now where the hell is page 3? Oh, here you go. Oh, you gotta do it like that. Alright, my bad, y'all. Alright, this page 3, right? Okay, let's go. Alright, Miss Jardine testified that she last saw the victim alive on the morning of May 25th, before his time of death was announced. She later went to the dealership to get his belongings, but never found his wallet, cellular phone, or handgun. On June 9th, 2020, Ms. Jardine reported the gun stolen. On cross-examination, Ms. Jardine acknowledged that the victim would carry large amounts of cash and his handgun on his person. However, he did not carry his handgun all of the time. On May 20, the defendant's and the victim's conversation escalated because the defendant was upset about his car, but they did not fight or argue. They came to an agreement, and the defendant left without incident. The victim was supposed to return some money to the defendant the next day, and Ms. Jardine did not feel the need to contact the police. On redirect examination, Ms. Jardine acknowledged that she did not know if the victim's handgun was on his person at the time of the shooting. She said that he carried the gun in his pocket sometimes, but that he usually kept the gun in a drawer or on his desk. Lance Freeman testified that he worked at a dealership across the street from B. Hicks and that he knew the victim. On May 21, 2020, Mr. Freeman was at work when someone ran inside and said there had been a shooting across the street. Mr. Freeman went outside and saw a man running. The man had a brown gun in his right hand and was wearing black and white shorts, blue underwear, and a white tank top. The man jumped over a fence, so Mr. Freeman got into his car and drove in that direction. He saw the man nonchalantly walking down the street. The man was holding a cellular telephone to his ear, so Mr. Freeman used his own cellular telephone to photograph the man. Mr. Freeman identified the photograph for the jury. The man ran between two houses, and Mr. Freeman showed the police where he last saw the man. On cross-examination, Mr. Freeman testified that he saw the man run out of vehicles. All right, Lance Freeman. Wesley Williams testified that on May 20, 2020, he drove the defendant to vehicles in Mr. Williams' silver Lexus. Oh, shit. Wesley Williams testified that on May 20, 2020, he drove the defendant to vehicles in Mr. Williams' silver Lexus. The next day, the defendant asked Mr. Williams to drive him to buy a new cellular phone. Mr. Williams drove the defendant to In and Out Wireless, a barbershop, and a Kroger grocery store. The defendant said he needed to return to vehicles, so Mr. Williams drove him to the dealership. The defendant went inside while Mr. Williams waited briefly in the car. Mr. Williams then went into the dealership. He did not see anybody in the lobby or office area, but heard the defendant and the victim arguing in the garage in the back of the dealership. Mr. Williams did not know the victim. Mr. Williams testified that he walked into the garage and stood next to the defendant. He did not see anything in the defendant's hands, and the victim was not holding a weapon. Mr. Williams did not know what the defendant and the victim were. Man, here we go again. Man. So this. All right. Did not see anything in the victim's hand. Hold on, y'all. Hold on for a minute. So there's 2. There's 4. So let me go back. There's 2. Yeah, this shit crazy. It's tricky. All right. Mr. Williams did not know what the defendant and victim were. So I gotta find 4. So there's 5. Man. Shit. 4. So, man, what the hell 4 it? So there's 3. There's 5. Oh man, this shit is crazy. That's 7. I mean, I'm doing something wrong. So that's 5. That's 3. So where the hell is 4? Man, my bad, y'all. I gotta find 4. Matter of fact, I'm gonna do it like this. Cause that just ain't gonna get it. There go 4 right here. Okay, here go 4 right here. So let's just do it like that. Let me see. Mr. Williams did not know what the defendant and the victim were. Let me blow this up on 4 though. Thank you. I got it now, y'all. All right. All right, so I'm just gonna go from side. All right, we back on track. My bad. Oh, let me see. All right. What did the victim and the defendant were arguing about? But the defendant suddenly shot the victim. Mr. Williams was scared, so he ran to his Lexus and drove away. He said he later returned to the dealership because he did not have anything to do with the shooting. On cross-examination, Mr. Williams testified that he waited in the Lexus while the defendant went into VX on May 20th. When the defendant returned to the car, Mr. Williams did not suspect anything was wrong. The next day, the defendant bought groceries at Kroger and did not seem upset or angry. Mr. Williams did not know the defendant had a gun or that a shooting was going to occur. Mr. Williams testified that when he entered VX on May 21st, he heard the victim and the defendant yelling at each other. The defendant's car was not at the dealership, so Mr. Williams did not know why the victim and the defendant were in the garage. 3 or 4 people were in the garage with the defendant and the victim. The defendant was not holding a gun, but Mr. Williams saw the defendant pull a gun out of his shorts and shoot the victim. Mr. Williams said he did not know if the victim had a gun or if the victim threatened the defendant. On redirect examination, Mr. Williams testified that he saw the defendant fire 2 shots. Amber Bird testified that the victim was like a father figure to her, that she knew him through her girlfriend, Zan. In May 2020, Ms. Bird worked at the VX detailing cars. She had been working there 4 or 5 months and cleaned the cars for resale. On May 20, Ms. Bird saw the defendant at the dealership. The next day, Ms. Bird was detailing that car when she saw 2 men arrive. She heard the victim say, "First of all, you're coming in here hostile. And why you got your hands in your pants like you holding something?" One of the men responded, "I'm not holding anything. I'm just scratching my balls." The victim stated, "I told you I was going to give you 700. Ms. Bird testified that Zan came and stood beside her. 15 seconds later, they heard gunshots and ran. Ms. Bird heard 3 shots before she ran and 1 shot after she ran for a total of 4 shots. She saw a silver car leave the dealership and saw the defendant run away. So she and Zan returned to the garage to check on the victim. Ms. Bird said that prior to the shooting, she saw the victim in his office with a wad of cash. A wad of cash. The state showed Ms. Bird a photograph of a man running in the parking lot after the shooting. A wad of cash. I don't know. Sometimes you got people working around you and you got a whole lot of money and they just getting $6 or $7, $8 an hour. I don't know. They might just set you up though. But let's go. The state showed Ms. Bird a photograph of a man running in the parking lot after the shooting. He was wearing black and white shorts and a white tank top, and he was holding a gun. Ms. Bird acknowledged the man was the defendant. On cross-examination, Ms. Bird testified that the shooting occurred about 4 p.m. She was outside the garage when she heard the altercation between the victim and the defendant. She did not see the victim or the defendant with a gun, and she did not witness the shooting. Officer Marcus Tobit of the Memphis Police Department, MPD, testified that he responded to the scene and that an African-American man was lying on the garage floor in a pool of blood. Officer Tobit's partner began rendering aid to the victim when Officer Tobit spoke with witnesses, including Amber Bird, Zandra Buckner, and Lance Freeman. The suspected shooter was described as an African-American male with dreadlocks, wearing a red bandana and white tank top and running from the scene. A second suspect drove away from the dealership but returned. On cross-examination, Officer Tobit acknowledged that the witnesses did not inform the police that money had been taken from the victim. Did not inform the police that money had been taken from the victim. Suspicious. Lieutenant Steve, whatever that is, Falsone, of the MPD testified that he arrived at Viggs about 1 hour after the shooting and that he became the lead investigator for the case. Blood and 2 or 3 cartridge cases were on the floor in the garage. The lieutenant spent 2 hours walking the path the defendant took after the shooting. He was looking for evidence and video cameras that could have recorded information. Another police officer found a cell phone on a street near the dealership. Officer Tristan Brown of the MPD testified that he went to the dealership to photograph the scene and collect evidence. A pool of blood, several spent cartridge cases, and bullet fragments were on the garage floor. Alexis Williams testified that in July 2020 she lived on Christie Shire Drive and that a man mowing her lawn found a gun in her yard. At that time, Ms. Williams was 3 or 4 months pregnant with the defendant's child. Hold up. Alexis Williams testified that in July 2020 she lived on Christie Shire Drive and that a man mowing her lawn found a gun in her yard. Oh, this is girlfriend. At that time, Ms. Williams was 3 or 4 months pregnant with the defendant's child. Ms. Williams did not know how the gun ended up in her yard and turned it over to the police. Damn, you ain't She said that she did not know Wesley Williams, but that he had been to her home several times. Hold up, her name was Alexis Williams. She the defendant. She pregnant with the defendant's child, and his name Wesley Williams, and she did not know Wesley Williams, but he had been to her home several times. Come on, what a coincidence, Williams on Williams. That's probably her daughter, his daughter or something. I'm gonna see how this gonna go. On cross-examination, Ms. Williams testified that her lawn had not been mowed in more than a month when the gun was found, and that the gun was located after the defendant was arrested for shooting the victim. On redirect examination, Ms. Williams acknowledged that the defendant was arrested at her home. Lieutenant Shane Tarina of MPD's homicide testified that the police initially investigated the shooting as an aggravated assault, with the defendant and Mr. Williams as suspects. The shooting became a homicide case when the victim died on May 25th. A cellular telephone found by a police officer turned out to be the defendant's telephone, and the serial number on the gun found in Ms. Williams' yard master serial number on the victim's gun. The serial number on the gun found in his girlfriend, y'all, master serial number on the victim's gun. So this nigga took his gun and his money. Okay. Oh man. 6 right here. Okay, it's the time. All right. On cross-examination, Lieutenant Tarina testified that the victim's gun was loaded when it was found. Ms. Jardine had reported that the victim's gun and wallet were missing, but she did not report that a specific amount of cash was missing. Cash money. Dr. Katrina Van Petter, Tennessee Regional Forensics Center, testified. All right, she performed the autopsy. All right, he got a gunshot wound to his right arm. The bullet traveled through his armpit, struck his 8th rib and right lung, and lodged in one of his vertebral bones. The victim was 33 years old at the time of his death and was otherwise healthy. She said the victim died of a gunshot wound to his right arm and chest. Manner of death homicide. All right, this is firearms, so we don't need to do all that. The Ruger was rusty. All right, so he shot him with a 40 cal. All right, the defendant. Now he really tell his story. The defendant testified that he met the victim via Facebook Marketplace. The defendant explained that he saw a Nissan Altima on the website, so he telephoned the victim about the car. The defendant looked at the car in person and bought the car for $2,700. A few days later, the car started smoking and having other issues. The defendant took the car to a mechanic, and the mechanic told him that the radiator needed to be replaced. The defendant bought a new radiator at AutoZone, and the mechanic installed it. The mechanic then told the defendant that the motor had locked up on the car. So the defendant contacted the victim. The victim told the defendant to come to the dealership to talk with him about the car. The defendant testified that on May 20th, 2020, he went to VHIX to speak with the victim. The defendant had a gun on his person for protection and was wearing a red bandana that he used as a mask due to the COVID pandemic. The defendant and the victim talked in the victim's office, and the victim said he would pay half the cost of a new motor. That he had a mechanic to do the work, and that he would loan the defendant a car while the Altima was being repaired. Sounds like pretty fair. The defendant was satisfied with the agreement and left the dealership. The defendant testified that the next day, Mr. Williams drove him to VHIX. The defendant still had a gun on his person for protection and entered the front of the dealership. The victim was talking on the telephone in his office, so the defendant waited in the lobby. When the victim finished talking on the telephone, he waved the defendant into his office. The defendant and the victim began discussing their agreement, and the victim got frustrated. It's his side of the story. The defendant's side of the story. The victim said that he would pay half the cost of a new motor and loan the defendant a car, but that the defendant would have to repair the Altima himself. But he would pay half the cost of a new motor and loan the defendant a car, but the defendant would have to repair the Altima himself. Okay, he told him you had somebody do the work for him at first. But it's his side of the story. The defendant accepted the new agreement and asked when the victim could loan him a car. The victim told the defendant to follow him. So the defendant followed the victim into the garage. The defendant testified that he thought the victim was going to loan him a car, and that he jokingly asked, Mr. Jardine, the car you're fixing to loan me, it's not going to be like the car you sold me. So he was trying to joke. The victim began yelling at the defendant. The victim's shirt was moving so that the defendant could see a gun on the victim's hip. The victim reached for the victim's gun. What? Oh, the victim reached for his gun. So the defendant reached for his gun. The defendant fired one shot, which traveled through his shorts and struck the floor. He then fired two more shots. He said that he did not know which shot struck the victim and that the victim fell to the floor. The defendant saw the victim's gun on the floor, so he picked up the gun and ran. He said he took the victim's gun because it was close to the victim. Other people were in the garage, and he did not want anyone to get the gun. The defendant testified that he lost his gun while he was running because it came off his hip. The defendant went to Ms. Williams' house and threw the victim's gun out the back door. After the defendant's arrest, he telephoned his father from jail. The defendant acknowledged telling his father that this didn't happen. The defendant said he lied to his father because I didn't want him to have that type of impression about me or look at me like that or nothing like that. The defendant acknowledged shooting the victim, but said he did so because the victim was angry, yelling, and reached for his gun. The defendant said he thought his life was in danger. On cross-examination, the defendant testified that he did not recall seeing Ms. Jardine at the dealership on May the 20th, and he denied that the victim offered to pay him $700. The defendant did not recall seeing Ms. Bird at the dealership on May 21st. A female was present at the time of the shooting, however, she had her back to him, so he could not identify her. The defendant bought a cell phone at In-N-Out Wireless on May 20th, and he had the new telephone with him at the time of the shooting. The defendant said that he did not realize Mr. Williams came into the garage prior to the shooting, and that Mr. Williams was not standing beside him at the time of the shooting. The defendant acknowledged that the victim asked why the defendant's hands were in his pocket, were in his pants. The defendant said he did not remember telling the victim that he was scratching his balls. The defendant testified that he saw the victim reach for his gun, so he shot the victim. The defendant requested to demonstrate his motion for the jury, and the trial court allowed him to stand and do so. The defendant said he reached into his pants and fired 3 shots, all in one motion, like bam, bam, bam. The first shot went through the defendant's shorts and struck the floor. The defendant fired the remaining shots in the general direction of the victim. The defendant's gun was a .40 caliber and working properly. The defendant saw the victim on the floor, saw a woman running, and heard the victim's gun fall onto the floor. He picked up the gun because other people were present. He acknowledged that he panicked and that he did not summon help for the victim. The defendant testified that he did not go into the victim's pockets after the shooting. At that point, the state showed the defendants the same photographs the state had shown of Ms. Bird. The photograph showed the defendant running from the dealership after the shooting. In the photograph, the defendant could be seen holding a gun and what appeared to be a green bag. The state asked the defendant, "What's in that green bag?" The defendant responded that he did not know and stated that it don't look like a bag to me. He acknowledged that he was not holding the green item when he entered the dealership. The defendant also acknowledged having a prior conviction of theft, value $1,000 or more. He denied taking any money from the victim. Officer Michael Harper of the Shelby County Sheriff's Office testified on rebuttal for the state and identified a recording of the jailhouse telephone call the defendant made to his father. The state played the recording for the jury. During the call, the defendant said, "I ain't shot nobody." During the final jury charge, the defendant court instructed the jury on self-defense. The jury rejected that defense and convicted the defendant of second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, and especially aggravated robbery. After the verdicts, the defendant entered open guilty pleas to possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. All right, let's see, man. All right, so all of this is, all right. So they had a sentencing hearing on March 6, 2023. Yeah, that wasn't even not too long ago. All right, it sentences 46 years for second-degree murder, 15 years for voluntary manslaughter, and 44 years for especially aggravated robbery. Hold up. 46 years for second-degree murder, 15 years for voluntary manslaughter, and 44 years for especially aggravated robbery. They sentenced him as range 3 career offender to 30 years for each conviction of being a felon in possession of a firearm. The trial court ordered that the defendant serve the sentences concurrently. Okay. Them motherfuckers was consecutively, boy. I'm gonna be in there till Jesus come back. The defendant contends that the evidence is insufficient to support his convictions of second-degree murder and special aggravated robbery. And that is that, y'all. So I just wondered, boy, that was long as hell. But that is what happens to Mia Jaye's brother. And I just thought that was interesting. True.